I've realized I had the mohawk for many years, but I never made a video with it. Greetings! This is not a usual video of mine, so I already apologize for that. If you are a subscriber, you should be used to Skyrim, Pokemon and cosplay videos, so it's strange to see me talking about World War II or serious stuff. The truth is that I'm using this channel because it's my only way to publish a story that I have pieced together like a puzzle, with the help of others of course. A story that we managed to reconstruct and that, if I wouldn't make this video, would be lost forever. But don't expect me to start making videos on wars and history, because that's just a one-off. It was already hard for me to make this video, and it's not such an ideal moment to talk about wars. This is the story of my grandfather during World War II. I want to face this as light-hearted as possible and not dwell too much on the sad events of the wars, and I will just tell a story. In this video you will find no glorification of ideals or wars. Maybe I'm being a bit selfish because this video has a meaning to me, but I realize that for most people this is useless, unless you're curious to hear a peculiar story. Now keep in mind that my grandfather died in the 90s when I was little, and so obviously I don't remember him much, and none of this information comes to me directly from him. It's my father, my uncle, my aunt, and the various documents and items that he left behind that allowed us to piece his story back together. So obviously I don't have my grandfather's permission to make this video, therefore I will censor some personal information, and I will try to be rather impartial because I do not know what he was thinking during these facts. I just know the facts. So where to begin? My grandfather's name was Goretto, for his friends Dominic Goretto, and I already started saying bullshit. And here we start already with peculiar facts. That is not a real name. I mean, his parents just made that up. But back then there were plenty of Italians with weird made-up names. A distant relative of mine names was Vienna, like the city in Austria. But apart from that, fascist rule in Italy started when he was around 13. I can't possibly know in details the ideals that he had while growing up, and I don't want to assume things. What I know is, was he a fascist? Yes, he was, there's no denying that. Was he a hardcore Mussolini fan? I don't think he was. Very few things in life are black or white, most of them are grey. For example, while I know he supported the fascist party and its ideals, I know he didn't like the lack of personal freedom that fascism brought. My grandfather was the town hall messenger, I don't know how to call it, used to deliver official messages to the citizens. Moreover, he was also the guardian of the town hall, and he used to live in the town hall because there were few apartments inside of it. And since he lived in a small town in central Italy, that meant that kinda everybody in town knew him, so he also knew some anti-fascists. Sometimes there would be inspections and investigations on anti-fascist activities with inspectors coming from nearby cities. My grandpa would always know when exactly these inspections would take place, and he would warn those anti-fascists, saying, hey, next Wednesday there will be a big inspections, how about you go away for a couple of days so they won't find you? They would have not been killed, but they were still against fascism and therefore they would have been punished for sure. Before World War II, my grandfather joined the military, and he was a military instructor, if that's how you call it. He basically trained soldiers, and of course he was a soldier himself. He was a pretty athletic guy after all, he even won a provincial marathon. One thing to keep in mind is that he was not part of the Italian Royal Army. He was part of the Black Shirts. That's at least how they used to call them in English. The Black Shirts, or Camicie Nere, were for Italy more or less what the Waffen-SS were for Germany. They started as paramilitary, but then they became an actual army, and they were considered elite soldiers, often better trained and better equipped compared to the regular armies. And they used to take orders directly from their dictators, the Black Shirts from Mussolini, Waffen-SS from Hitler. My grandfather served in the War of Ethiopia between 1935 and 36. Then he was stationed in Libya for a bit of time, and then he took part in the invasion of Albania in 1939. So as you can imagine, he was always away from home. Here's a picture of my grandfather on a camel, smiling. Well, why wouldn't you smile on a camel? I even have a certificate signed by Mussolini himself. It was for the celebration of the conquest of Albania. Then World War II started and Grandpa was sent back to Albania as Italy was trying to invade Greece through the newly acquired Albania. The only thing that I know is that he, along with other fascists, and especially people who weren't even fascists, were getting increasingly upset and confused on why Italy was attacking neutral and innocent countries that never really did anything bad to Italy, minding their own business. Sure, Greece was allied with Britain, which was an enemy of fascist Italy, but that's a bit too small of a reason. The Italian advance was stopped and the Greek counteroffensive pushed the Italian forces back into Albania. I don't pretend to exactly know how he was feeling at the time, but certainly I know that he was witnessing more and more often how unprepared the Italian armed force were for the war. Now consider that my grandfather at the time was Sergente Maggiore. I don't know how to translate that into English. Sergeant Major? I know in German his grade was Unterfeldwebel, which is an officer that is involved in the battlefield with a rifle in his hands. We call them Sottufficiale, in German is Unteroffiziell, and in English, I don't know, lower rank officer? I have no idea how military ranks in English work. In any case, what I mean to say is that he wasn't so low in the military rank to be fed all this propaganda juice, but he wasn't even so high in the ranks that he knew the actual truth and he wasn't lied to. As he once told Grandma when he had the chance to meet her again, they promised us tanks, they promised us planes, they promised us ships, they promised us everything. Then we went there and we struggled to have basic equipment. He grew disappointed and disillusioned of the fascist regime. Maybe not of the ideals, I wouldn't know, but certainly he understood he was being lied to. And it wasn't just about the equipment, it was also how incompetent some of his superiors were. Okay, funny story time for light-hearted, happy people. I am unsure exactly when and where it happened. I just know it happened in the Balkans 1940-1941. My grandpa and his troops were marching up some mountain pass. There was an officer with them, and I don't know if he was part of the Italian Royal Army or the Black Shirts, as they often used to work together. This officer used to fall behind the column of soldiers a bit too often. He was too often stopping to rest. He used to have a big-ass backpack on his shoulders, like even bigger than the normal soldier backpacks, and sometimes he was so tired that he would ask soldiers or lower-rank officers to carry it for him. So my grandpa's turn to carry it came, and he was like, okay, I'll carry it. He puts the backpack on his shoulders and he feels like it's so incredibly heavy, like unnaturally heavy, as if it was filled with rocks. Like, it was absurd how heavy it was.
What's in these bags, rocks?
So he was thinking, well, there's no way that this is just military equipment, like, how? So he made up an excuse and was like, oh yeah, let me look at the map. He put the backpack on the ground, opened it, to find that it was indeed filled with rocks.
Hey, these are rocks! Why is your suitcase full of rocks?
So he was like, officer, care to explain why the backpack is filled with rocks? I am a collectionist and I saw that there are many funnily shaped rocks around here, so I'm bringing them with me. Needless to say, he and the other lower rank officer emptied the officer's backpack full of rocks. During the Greek campaign, my grandfather even received a solemn commendation, which is some sort of a medal, but without the actual physical metal thing. Probably because Italy needed every single gram of metal that they could get. According to the paper, which is in my possession, he led his outnumbered black shirt unit in a successful counteroffensive against the Greek army, reconquering some positions. Eventually, since the front line was standing still for a lot of time, Mussolini asked Hitler for help. But the German intervention in the Balkans didn't include just Greece, it was also Yugoslavia. For reasons, don't expect me to start teaching you the entire history of the world. Italy was supposed to participate in the invasion of Yugoslavia, invading from the north border, but also from the south, from Albania. And my grandpa's unit was one of the units moved from the Greek-Albanian border to the Yugoslav-Albanian border. Especially during the invasion of Yugoslavia, my grandpa witnessed the horrors of the war. And here's why. Yugoslavia was being surrounded and invaded by Germany, Italy and Hungary. The Yugoslav generals realized that they had very little chance of winning, so they retreated the army south, almost completely ignoring the north part and the Axis invading from north, and they focused the vast majority of their efforts against the Italian forces in Albania. They knew they would have been outnumbered, they knew they would have been weakened by the war against Greece, and obviously that they were worsely equipped compared to the Germans. So the Yugoslav strategy was to invade Albania, destroy the Italian divisions stationed there, so that they could basically reach the Greek army and then fight the Axis together. But the Yugoslav army wasn't well equipped either, so their advance in Albania was stopped and they were pushed back by the Italian divisions there, and so the Italian divisions started their own invasion of Yugoslavia. For a few days near the Yugoslav-Albanian border, chronicles talk about very heavy fighting and violent battles, which made up the majority of battles that happened in the Yugoslav campaign. Eventually the Germans arrived into that zone and the Yugoslav troops were overwhelmed. I can only shudder to imagine what Grandpa saw in those days, and I imagine it was even worse for the innocent Yugoslav soldiers and citizens. I have a picture of my grandfather posing on the remains of a Yugoslav planes that his troops shot down, but I won't post the picture because, as I said, I don't want glorifications of war. I can't be sure where his heart was in those days, but I know that he always tried to boost the morale, to do his duty of an officer and try to rally the troops. I do know he tried to avoid unnecessary violence, a story that he used to tell to my aunt about an encounter he had with a thief. I don't know if it was Albanian or Yugoslav. Grandpa found a guy that managed to break into the tent building shack that Italian troops used to keep food in. He saw the guy and told him, "I will count to 10. If you're still in sight, I will shoot you." Of course, he told him that in Italian, so I'm not sure what the guy understood. But probably hearing my grandfather counting, he understood it was better to get out of there, and he disappeared. And I suppose that's the least that Grandpa could have done. Grandpa was stationed in Albania and Yugoslavia until September 1943. In July 1943, Mussolini was overthrown by the Italian king, so there was a lot of uncertainty among the soldiers, including my grandfather, who expressed this in a couple of letters sent to my grandmother. And in these letters you can read the conflict inside my grandfather. On one side he tries to be a soldier and he says, "We will not give up, we will take Sicily back from the Americans, we won't surrender," while mentioning an unnaturally amount of time the motherland. On the other hand, he writes to my grandma, "I wish I could leave, I wish I could leave and never come back, because the only thing that matters right now is to be with you and the kids," because he saw the big shortcomings of the regime. Now, this is very important. My grandfather was in a black shirt legion, and he was an officer in charge of a detachment unit that used to work with an Italian Royal Army division. At times, soldiers of Blackshirt's legions didn't use to operate all together, rather they used to split them in smaller units, smaller support units, that they would go and work with either Italian Royal Army divisions or German divisions or other Blackshirt legions. In that division of the Royal Army my grandpa used to work with, there were several friends of my grandfather from the town in central Italy, like people that he knew before the war. On the 5th of September 1943, Grandpa and his Blackshirt soldiers met with their friends from the Italian Royal Army Division, who proposed them to become officially royal soldiers and quit being Blackshirts. My grandfather wrote in a letter that he was thinking to accept that he would have continued the war in the Royal Army. But a couple of days later, on the 8th of September 1943, the King of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele III, officially surrendered to the Allies. This came out of the blue for many soldiers, for most soldiers, because in the previous months, the new Italian government kept repeating that there would have been no surrendering and they would have kept on fighting against the Allies. Only high-rank officers knew what the government was doing, and my grandfather wasn't one of them. Immediately after announcing the armistice, the Italian king fled from Rome, leaving basically the entirety of the Italian forces scattered around the world, with no orders except, yeah, we're out of this war. But one thing was immediately clear, that the destiny of Italian soldiers would have differed a lot one from another. The entire corps of the Blackshirts immediately sided with the Germans. The officers and the hardcore fascists saw even the act of surrendering as a betrayal, especially now that Mussolini had been imprisoned by the king for more than 1 month. I think my grandfather was disappointed as well, and might have seen this as a betrayal, because it was a bit too much of a coincidence that few days before the armistice he was being proposed to join the Italian Royal Army. There's a chance that officers in the Italian Royal Army tried to lure as many Blackshirts as possible into their own ranks, in the prospect of the Blackshirts disobeying the order of surrender. To put it simply, after the armistice, German troops started confronting Italian forces, and they usually gave them 3 options. Option number 1, you keep on fighting for the Axis. Option number 2, you surrender, you give up your weapons to the Germans, and you get imprisoned. Option number 3, you resist, and so the Germans attack your unit and disarm you with force or kill you. As I said, the corps of the Blackshirts had no doubt and chose option number 1, siding with the Germans alongside few Italian Royal Army units, but the great majority of the Italian Royal Army forces chose option number 2, they peacefully surrendered, because at that point they had no reason to fight neither for nor against the Germans. But some Italian units chose option number 3 and refused to peacefully surrender, and therefore had to be attacked by the Germans. One of those divisions that chose option number 3 was the Italian Royal Army division that my grandpa used to work with. So at that point, imagine, my grandpa and his men had to choose. On one side were his fellow Blackshirts and obviously his friends, alongside their German allies that my grandpa always was loyal to. On the other side there was that Italian Royal Army division and many of his hometown friends. Grandpa and his men understood that whatever they would have chosen, they would have had to shoot at their own friends. I can't tell you what he was thinking in those days, because I do not know it. I know what he did alongside his men. They went to the Germans and said, look, we are loyal to you, but we are not going to shoot other Italians, especially our friends. So make us prisoners. He volunteered to be put in a prison camp rather than shooting at his own friends, and I admire that. Especially when you consider how harsh the conditions for war prisoners were, and how obvious their victory against the Italian Royal Army Division would have been, because there was no way that with their poor armament they would have been able to resist the Germans and the Black Shirts. So he became a prisoner of war and he was sent to the Banat, a region in East Yugoslavia. I have a little paper in German that was given to the prisoners of that camp. It's quite ruined, but it says that it was a sort of an air base and prisoners were supposed to work from 5 a.m. until sunset. My grandpa kept this paper with him, and it might have been a decision that would save his life later. He stayed in a prison camp for at least 2 months, as the next step that we managed to reconstruct is that in the winter 1943-1944 he was again a free soldier, aka he resumed the fight for the Axis. I'm just guessing, but maybe he waited for the situation to stabilize, since now in all Axis-controlled territories the Italian forces were all pro-Axis, and the Italian forces that were not pro-Axis were prisoners. The Italian Social Republic was formed soon after the Armistice, a new Italian fascist state that resumed immediately the fight alongside Germany, and that was trying to reform an army as big as possible. So my grandpa agreed to fight for Germany and the Italian Social Republic, and he was moved from East Yugoslavia to Vienna, Austria, because apparently that's where most of the Black Shirts that operated in the Balkans were now stationed, as now they were serving in subordination to the German forces in Yugoslavia. The thing is, he was sent to Vienna, but when I say sent, I mean he was told to march there. Obviously not alone, but he basically had to march from East Yugoslavia to Vienna across Hungary, and in Hungary Grandpa lived another share of adventures. He came back home with stories about him sleeping in a barn with animals one night, or a story about he and his men being very short on supplies and food and being aided by a Hungarian family. That Hungarian family offered Grandpa some food, and my aunt recalls Grandpa describing that food as something that looked like pasta with a tomato sauce, and I can just imagine Grandpa being like, ah, finally, something that reminds me home. No, it wasn't. When he tasted it, that tomato sauce was a sort of sweet jam. I have no clue, and probably he had no clue of what it was, but he was so hungry that probably it tasted good. Moreover, I don't know why, but he crossed the frozen Balaton Lake. The Balaton Lake is a lake, in Hungary, that during harsh winters freezes to a certain degree that allows people to walk across it, or at least across a part of it. And I might be wrong, but from what I've gathered, this happened around 4 or 5 times a century, which meant Grandpa had to march across Hungary during a very rigid winter. But the question is, why did he cross it? Like, he probably even had heavy military equipment with him on his shoulders. I wouldn't know. In Austria, Grandpa was stationed in Auhof in western Vienna. In Auhof there was a Luftwaffe airbase as well as a prison camp that held Italian prisoners of war that refused to keep on fighting for the Axis. I don't know what my grandpa's status was, if he was working in the prison camp or if he was working in the airbase as an auxiliary troop, but I know he was a free soldier and not a prisoner. This is proven by a letter that my grandma sent to my grandpa in Vienna, dated May 1944, that my grandpa never received and that was sent back to central Italy in November 1945, and that I managed to decipher. First of all, we can read Feldpost, German military mail service, LGPA, Luftgau-Postamt. It's airmail, presumed managed by the Luftwaffe. Vienna is Vienna. 52262 is a Feldpost code on where the letter had to be delivered. The L in front means it's for a Luftwaffe member. UFW in front of my grandpa's name means Unterfeldwebel, which was a military grade in Nazi Germany, which was equivalent to Sergente Maggiore in the Italian armed forces. I don't know if Grandpa was officially a Luftwaffe member or an Italian Social Republic soldier that was allowed to use the mail service for Luftwaffe members, but well, nothing much changes. But why did I show you that letter? That will be important later. The letter never reached my grandfather in Vienna because probably by that time it arrived, he already left. He was probably called to serve on the battlefield alongside German and other Italian Social Republic troops in Yugoslavia against partisan activity. That's what most of the black shirts stationed in Austria used to do. Here's some old German money that Grandpa brought home. And after an unknown period of time, probably towards the end of 1944, he was sent back to Italy in the northern city of Bergamo. Now understand that the Allies were marching north, conquering more and more of the Italian peninsula, getting closer and closer to Grandpa's hometown. Therefore, communications became very difficult. For long periods of time, while he was in Yugoslavia, nobody heard of him. And while he was in Bergamo, central Italy was falling to the Allies. For months nobody knew what he was up to, and of course they feared he was dead. I'd like to open a little parenthesis on what my ancestors were doing during this period of time while Grandpa was in between Bergamo and Yugoslavia. My grandma's brother suffered a cruel destiny. He was some sort of a night guard, sort of a law enforcer, I guess. He was a supporter of the Italian Social Republic and he befriended various German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, which he used to meet while he was patrolling at night. One day though, the Wehrmacht unit stationed there was replaced with a Waffen-SS unit newly arrived. The Waffen-SS soldiers, not knowing him, they stopped him and asked him for documents and a license since he was carrying a gun. He was so unlucky that that night his license was in revision and he was carrying only a sort of a temporary license. The Waffen-SS didn't believe him, they rounded him up with other people they believed they were rebels and executed him. During the peak of the Allied bombings, my grandpa's family left the town hall to go to the outskirts of the town in the countryside. With them there was a German unit that had the task of slowing down the American advance, while other German and Italian divisions were retreating across the Apennine mountains beyond the Gothic line fortification. So at the feet of the mountains, the Germans built trenches and fortifications to slow down the Americans. But the Americans tried to trick them and literally went up the mountains with their tanks and their armored vehicles from another way, like they did a big loop around, in an attempt to surround the German positions from the other side. But somehow the Germans understood that, and one night they received the order of an immediate retreat. So in a few minutes they grabbed everything they could get and they jumped on their vehicles and retreated north as well. Meanwhile, my relatives went into hiding because they thought that when the Americans would have arrived they would have murdered them. The Americans arrived with their vehicles the morning after, not finding the Germans and not murdering my relatives. Few days later, without Germans nor Americans around, the Italian partisans arrived in that place. Someone informed them that my grandpa's brother, who was hiding there with my grandma and her 2 kids, might have been a German spy. Why is that? Simply because he knew how to speak some German, and back then in rural central Italy nobody knew a foreign language, they barely knew Italian, and of course the partisans knew that Grandpa was a fascist. That was enough for those partisans to show up there and kill him. My grandpa's brother, who was like 20 or 21 at the time, had no interest in politics, wasn't supporting any particular regime, he was just minding his own business. The partisans came and carried him out of the house, and my uncle, who was 7 at the time, still remembers the words of his uncle basically, while he was being dragged out. Now these people will kill me, avenge me. They brought him out, put his back against a wall, but he was lucky that nearby there was, among the people hiding from the bombings, an old lady that lived around there who I guess the partisans trusted and they knew her. She convinced them that he was just a guy that had no interest in the war and was just living his own life and just happened to know some German. That lady saved his life. But I don't know if the partisans would have been convinced if they knew that in that moment grandfather was part of the Italian Social Republic. Grandpa's brother survived the war, but he unfortunately passed away in the 50s because of an illness. A few days later, my family went back to the town hall, to their apartment, as the Allied bombing stopped. The Germans left in a hurry the town hall as well, as they were stationed there, trying to grab any supply that they could find. And among those things that they grabbed, there was my own piano. Why did the Germans take a whole piano with them? What for? Like, I could understand you're a musician and you're like, oh, that's a very nice violin or a flute, but a whole big-ass piano? Someone eventually found that piano up in the mountains in the outskirts of the town. They abandoned it there. I can only imagine the conversation between those German soldiers that grabbed the piano and probably a German officer, a bit similar to the conversation that my grandpa had with a rock-loving officer. Was ist das? Es ist ein Klavier. Talking about the town hall, Grandpa's family had a front seat when dealing with foreign soldiers, because often in small towns, since the town hall is the biggest building of the town, foreign forces would take that as a headquarters. Therefore, the town hall was used first by Germans, then by Americans, and then by British. My aunt, who was around 10 at the time, recalls the difference between them. Of course, what I'm saying is about a specific town, don't take this as a rule. She remembers that many Germans were young and that they didn't have much with them. Little food, little supplies, they used to keep to themselves, but often they would share their leftovers with the town kids. Few times they gave something to my great-grandpa as well. By the way, my great-grandpa never even left the town hall, not even under the Allied bombings. That's how little care for the war he had. My great-grandfather's name was Cesare. This was his woodcutter axe. It's original, more than 100 years old. And the Germans gave him a sort of a jelly pudding, all colored and wobbly. And he was like, what the hell is this? As he never saw anything like that. And Aunt remembers it tasted rather bland. When the Germans left in a hurry, one German soldier forgot his leather aviator cap, something like that. So my great-grandpa took it and wore it often for many years to come, looking like a steampunk pimp. Then the Americans took over the town hall, and the Americans had everything. They used to parade around towns with jeeps and threw like candies and chocolates and chewing gums to the kids on the streets, like, remember, we're the good guys, you have to cheer for us. And again, kids here didn't know what chewing gums were, so they would put them in their mouths and be like, why is it not breaking down? The Americans in this town used to share their food and used to drink a lot. They used to be a bit less disciplined compared to the Germans. Aunt remembers the sight of American soldiers being passed out drunk in the town. A drunkard even tried to force his way into Grandpa's apartment. My grandma was lucky that great-grandpa was there. He took his cane and started beating the shit out of the American soldier out of his apartment. And again, I wonder if the Americans would have treated my family different had they known that my grandpa was still fighting against them. After the Americans, the British took over the town hall, and Ont remembers that they used to have more than the Germans but less than the Americans. Those that were in my town didn't used to share anything with anybody, not even to hungry children. They still saw Italians as enemies, and well, many still were their enemies. Talking about the other side of my family, my other grandpa was one of the relatively few Italians that knew how to drive a car back then. Therefore, his role in the Italian Royal Army was to drive supply trucks in the desert in North Africa. Basically, he was running the Dakar before the Dakar was a thing. What a pioneer. He was captured by the British, I don't know when, and was released after the war. He died before I was born, so I can't tell you much about him either. His future wife and grandma of mine used to live in a small town that remained under Axis control until almost the end of the war. She remembers that the Germans that were in her town were young boys often, and that they used to be kind as they would chop some wood for the families there in exchange for food and other supplies. In contrast, she remembers that both fascists and partisans used to be more assertive, more bossy towards their compatriots. When the Germans retreated north in the last stages of the war, two young German soldiers stayed behind to surrender to the Allies. One villager convinced the two German boys to put on some civilian clothes and he would have handled the rest. And this guy went to the Americans and said, "Hey, there are two German soldiers posing as civilians in my house." These two young Germans probably didn't know that that was a war crime. A soldier cannot pose as a civilian. The punishment for this war crime is execution. So the Americans came and executed those two German boys. Everyone in town was disgusted by this guy, who they all see as a murderer who caused the death of two young boys sent to fight in a foreign land. And understand that when you live in a small mountain village, as my grandma did, you don't want a murderer as a neighbor. But nobody could touch him or do anything about it because he was under the protection of the Americans. But soon after the war, he got an illness and died. As grandma told me, nobody cried and nobody went to his funeral. Karma, bitch. Back to my grandpa in Bergamo. He was serving in the Italian Social Republic forces, but I am unaware of the details. What I have from this period of time are two drawings gifted to him by a German officer he was serving alongside. I guess they became good friends, or maybe it was a sign of respect and appreciation. One is the drawing of the castle of Brescia, a city near Bergamo. The other one is a snowy Zagreb, capital city of Croatia. Both are dated 1945, so they must have been done in either January or February. My guess is Grandpa served with this German officer in Zagreb or other places in the Balkans, and eventually they were moved either together or maybe one before and the other later to northern Italy, where Grandpa was gifted with these two drawings. Some years later, Grandpa wrote on one of them Foster, as he thought was the surname of the German officer. But I don't think Foster is a German surname, or at least doesn't sound like it. Maybe he mistook and meant Förster. Grandpa didn't know much German, so I can't be sure of the name of this person, and the only thing to identify him would be this logo/signature he left on both drawings. This is the compass my grandpa used during the war. It still works. And I was trying to figure out why there was written W and O over here, because that's not Italian, it doesn't make sense in English either. But that's West and Öst, which is German. This is a German compass. So I suppose he got this during the Italian Social Republic days, or maybe the Luftwaffe. In spring 1945, a combination between partisans' insurrection and the final breach of the Gothic Line by the Allies spelled the end of the Italian Social Republic and the Axis forces in Italy. Italian Social Republic forces received an ultimatum by the partisans and the Allies. If they would have surrendered, their lives would have been spared. The ones that would be captured by the Allies would be sent to a prison camp for a lengthy period of time, as far away as Texas. In the prison camp, they would be investigated for war crimes against the Allies, and according to the result of that investigation, some would get executed, but the great majority would eventually be released. We now know how these things worked, but understand that back then the Axis soldiers didn't know this procedure, so they wouldn't know their destiny in case of surrendering. The ones that instead surrendered to the partisans, well, partisans didn't have prison camps. So for them, surrendering to the partisans was way more dangerous than surrendering to the Allies. But understand that more often than not, it's not like soldiers really had a choice. Even if they wanted to surrender to the Allies, well, maybe the Allies were just simply too far away. And it's not like German and Italian officers would just let you go and surrender, like, hey, I'm going to the Allies to surrender, oh sure, bye! And even if you deserted and tried to reach the Allies, there's no guarantee that some partisans or maybe some other Axis units wouldn't intercept you and execute you straight away. In the last days of the war, when everything was coming down, my grandpa and his men ditched their military uniform, put on some civilian clothes and went into hiding. I don't know the circumstances of it, maybe they were cornered, maybe they just grew sick of it. I'm sure they had realized since a long time that the war was lost. But remember what I said about a soldier posing as a civilian? That's a war crime, it's an act of perfidy, and the punishment is execution. And they knew it well, which makes me think they were cornered and had very little choice. There was no easy way out. Soon after, the war was over and lost, and the Italian Social Republic was no more. But dangers for Grandpa were far from over. Italian partisans started hunting down every former Italian Social Republic soldier or even former fascist, everyone they could find. Italy was now in their hands and in the Allies' hands, so many epurations and summary executions took place. While hiding in various places in Bergamo, Grandpa had two run-ins with partisans, and I don't know which one happened first. A group of partisans from Bergamo was on the hunt of a certain Goretto. Either someone leaked something to them, or they already knew the names of few officers. They entered the house of this woman, who was giving hospitality to my grandpa alongside few other people, searching for a guy named Goretto but not knowing his face. My grandpa had the audacity of telling them, "Oh, what, you're searching for someone called Goretto? Here, let me help you." "Goretto, are you here? Goretto, is that you?" Eventually, though, the partisans figured out that this was the guy they were searching for. Maybe because he didn't even have documents with him, which he discarded because on the documents there was written his military grade in the Italian Social Republic. They took him and brought him to an isolated place to kill him. I don't know exactly what happened, but a young partisan took pity of my grandfather. Maybe Grandpa showed him the little piece of paper that he had from the prison camp in an attempt to convince the partisans that he had been a prisoner, as well as mentioning that he had two kids waiting for him at home. Whatever it was, he was spared and he had the young partisan to thank. The second time, it was actually Grandpa and his men who went into hiding with him, who approached a partisan, I suppose a rather important one, and they did so through a priest. Now, my grandfather and his men were blatantly lying. They were saying that they were former prisoners of war who managed to escape. Obviously, they couldn't have told the truth, but I wonder if somebody else in this situation was on their side and actually knew the truth. The priest presented them to a partisan, who in turn presented them to other partisans to receive some sort of a written recognition that they had been prisoners of war and had meant no harm. I wonder if the priest or maybe the first partisan knew who these people were. But in any case, Grandpa obtained these small documents from the CLN, Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale, which were the Italian partisans. This was a good card in his hands, but not one that would guarantee him safety. At this point, my grandpa also needed new documents because having known was very suspicious, but simply going to the town hall in Bergamo and requesting new documents was very dangerous because the allies and the partisans were in control of everything right now, and it was suspicious. So the woman who gave Grandpa hospitality in Bergamo suggested to meet up with a guy from the town hall who also did illegal business, and that could maybe supply him with a fake ID. Well, not even a fake ID, because I do have Grandpa's ID in those documents, and all the datas are real. It's just that, like this, he could have been able to bypass all the process and investigations on why he had no identifications. In any case, he got in contact with this guy. I don't know his name, but let's say his name was Stefan. This is a story that my aunt told me, so take it as it is. They met up at night, up on the walls of the ancient town of Bergamo. My grandpa was like, "So, you're Stefan, right?" "Yes, I'm Stefan, but you can call me Stephanie." "I can make you a fake ID, but only if you spend some time with me." So my grandpa grabbed this guy by the neck and almost threw him off the walls of the old city. They were pretty high, he would have died. "How about you give me the documents right now and I don't throw you off?" Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to laugh, but it's so stupid. So after obtaining a new ID through death threats, Grandpa traveled with unknown means to central Italy. And from his family's perspective, the last time that they heard of him was end of 44, beginning of 45. While now we were at the end of May 45. Grandma knew very well that he could have been dead, and considered that even after the war, Grandpa couldn't have written to Grandma any letter, because the post office in our town was in the hands of the partisans, who knew who he was and would have figured out his hideout or his business. Grandpa arrived in a nearby city and hid at a relative's house for a few days, and then he finally met his family again, and I can only imagine Grandma's joy, until he decided to go back to the town, to his town. But in small towns, words are quick to go around, and not even one day after he set foot back into his town, the gendarmerie showed up at his door to arrest him. The gendarmerie officer told Grandpa, "I will bring you to the military district headquarters in the city for interrogation. And consider I am doing you a favor, because if partisans showed up at your door, they wouldn't be so kind." The gendarmerie, who was operating under the Allies' orders, brought Grandpa to the military district headquarters. There were American officers interrogating all people from the zone who were suspected by partisans of having been fascist or Italian Social Republic soldiers who didn't result as prisoners of the Allies in their own archives. I told you what happened to Italian Social Republic soldiers, prisoners of the Allies. The Allies would investigate. If they would have found war crimes, the Italian soldiers would have been executed. If not, they would have been released. But this did not apply to Grandpa and people like him anymore. The interrogation wasn't to find out if he committed any war crimes, it was to find out if he was a part of the Italian Social Republic. Because from the moment in which the Americans didn't see my grandpa's name in their list of prisoners of war, and they could find proofs that Grandpa was part of the Italian Social Republic, Grandpa would have been automatically considered a war criminal, because this would have implied that Grandpa, as a soldier, didn't surrender, evaded capture and put on civilian clothes, which is the war crime of perfidy. And since this is exactly what happened, yes, according to the Allies, my grandpa was a war criminal, and the punishment would have been summary execution without trial. I'm honestly not bothered that the Allies would have considered my grandpa a war criminal, as his war crime was to evade capture, basically. I don't even know if he had any choice, and this crime of his pale in comparison to some of the stuff that the Allies did that went unpunished. Well, when I say that he was considered a war criminal by the Allies, I mean that he would have been considered so if the Allies would have found out, which they didn't. Grandfather knew what he was going to face once back home, so he told Grandma to destroy and burn every proof and every letter that would link him to the Italian Social Republic, so even if they would have searched the house, they would have found nothing. He prepared in his mind a story that he made up as plausible as he could in case of interrogation. So when he was interrogated, he had to convince them that this story was true. When questioned, Grandpa didn't deny that he had been a fascist. Way too many people knew, and it would have been impossible to deny. But that already won him some trust from the American officer, who told him something like, "Finally we found someone who admits that he was a fascist. Many that we interrogated just tried to deny the obvious." The American officer believed the story of my grandpa, and that is mainly because Americans and Italian partisans as well weren't involved in the Balkan and Eastern fronts, so they didn't know, especially back then, still in 1945, how things developed, the times that they developed in that part of Europe. But we in our times can see how improbable the story is. He declared that after the Armistice, he and his men joined forces with the Albanian partisans to fight against the Germans, and then he was captured. He had to convince them that he didn't disobey the king, but he knew that it wasn't realistic to say, "Oh yes, me and few of my men just stood up against an entire German division and we all survived." Yeah, right. Nor it was wise to suggest that they joined forces with the Italian Royal Army Division against the Germans, because in that case the interrogators could have easily verified that, going to the Italian Royal Army officers and being like, "Hey, do you remember if there were black shirts alongside you when you were attacked by the Germans?" "No." "Well, ladies and gentlemen, we got him." So he made up this story about the Albanian partisans, which is very implausible considering that probably the biggest enemy of the anti-Italian Albanian partisans were black shirts. But Grandpa knew that they had no way of going to Albania to ask random people, "Hey, were you a partisan? Do you remember these black shirts?" Obviously not. He said that he crossed Hungary in the winter of 1944-45 instead of 43-44. So he basically made up a whole year of prison camp when he was in prison camp a couple of months. And that is again impossible, because in the winter of 44-45 Hungary was a battlefield. The Soviet Union was attacking Hungary, and by then the Red Army had conquered the majority of Hungary. So Grandpa going from Yugoslavia to Austria, passing through Hungary, would mean that he passed through battlefields and zones that were under Russian control. He then declared that he was in the prison camp of Auhof, since he knew the name of Auhof and he knew there was a prison camp there, and he was liberated after the Battle of Vienna in spring 1945 by the Red Army. Another very implausible thing, because usually the Red Army wouldn't really liberate Italian prisoners, they would take them as their own prisoner. But of course in 1945 the American officer couldn't have possibly known much about these things, so they weren't so absurd. But Grandpa had also some proofs that supported the story that he told. The first one is indeed the piece of paper that he got in the German prison camp in Yugoslavia. There's no name on it, but it's a good hint that Grandpa had been a prisoner, which he had, just only in reality for a couple of months. The partisans sort of certificate that at least indicates that the partisans were theoretically alright with him, that he obtained by the partisans in Bergamo. And the third one is a document that Grandma obtained from the town hall. Basically after the Armistice, when Germans started making Italian soldiers prisoners, the Italian soldiers who refused to continue the fight, the Germans used to notify the Kingdom of Italy that a certain soldier had been taken as prisoner. The Kingdom of Italy would give a small monetary compensation to the family of the soldier who was taken prisoner. But if that prisoner would later choose to fight for the Axis and the Italian Social Republic, the Germans usually didn't notify the Kingdom of Italy, they would notify the Italian Social Republic. But many of the Italian Social Republic archives were destroyed, mostly on purpose, in the last days of the war, which hid the names of many people involved in it and saved various lives. And so this document that Grandma obtained in the town hall certified that the family of Grandpa received this compensation until the end of the war. So it would suggest that Grandpa was prisoner for 20 months instead of 2. So with these documents in hands and no concrete proof that Grandpa had joined the Italian Social Republic, the Allies let him go. They basically declared that he was cool for the Allies, but some partisans didn't agree with that. Remember that letter that Grandma sent to Grandpa while he was in Vienna? Grandpa never received it, as he was probably already in Yugoslavia, so the letter remained in Vienna until the end of the war. Then it was sent back to central Italy, to our town, by the new Austrian authorities, and it arrived in November 1945. This letter was obviously opened in the post office under partisans' orders, and Grandpa was extremely lucky that in this letter Grandma never mentions anything about the Italian Social Republic. This letter talks about the death of Grandma's brother, so all the letter is focused on that. On the outside of the letter there is UFW, Unterfeldwebel, and the L in front of the code, which meant a member of the Luftwaffe, but I doubt that the workers of the post office of the town knew what they all meant. Still, this letter could have been extremely dangerous for my grandfather, but it was also probably the most important piece of the puzzle that allowed us to piece all the story back together. If those people in Vienna wouldn't have sent back this letter, our story reconstruction would have been very different. In this period of time, my grandpa's health wasn't doing good, probably because of the lifestyle he had to follow while in the war or in hiding, and he contracted malaria, which is a deadly illness. He was in bed with very high fever, and Grandma was trying to heal him as she could, but she could only rely on very few trustworthy people. He couldn't so easily go out to the doctor because there were still people around who wanted him dead. One of those days in which he was in bed, the partisans, or anyway some anti-fascist group, barged into the town hall and went upstairs to get a woman who had been a non-supporter of the Italian Social Republic. They brought her to the balcony and, in front of a crowd, shaved her head. This was probably the lightest punishment for a woman who supported the Italian Social Republic and that were captured by the partisans. Some had a much worse fate. For men it was often a harsher punishment. You would be lucky if you came out with your life. Grandma had nothing to fear because everybody knew that she didn't care about politics and had never been a fascist. She just had a fascist husband. So one of those people who barged into the town hall asked her, "So where is your husband?" Grandma lied, saying that Grandpa was being detained for a lengthy period of time by the gendarmerie, while in reality Grandpa was laying in his bed with high fever. The partisan believed her and didn't go check. Grandpa survived the illness, as I think it was a light version of malaria, but it wasn't over yet. 2 men from our town sent a letter to the prefecture specifically requesting my grandfather to be executed for his contribution to the fascist regime and forces prior to the Armistice of 1943. Also because one of them was interested in Grandpa's job in the town hall, so the prefecture rejected this request, as they knew about his interrogation already, to which the mayor of the town replied, insisting the prefecture to reconsider the decision and at least kick him out of the town hall. The prefecture rejected again. Of course, all of this, even the request for him to be executed, was done in ignorance of Grandpa's rule in the Italian Social Republic between 1943 and 1945. But what he did prior to 1943 was already enough for some people. Eventually things would start to calm down, but it would be a while before Grandpa's life would be back on track. Many friends he knew before the war would pretend that they don't know him and try to avoid him, to which he was very disappointed of. Eventually the Italian government recalled the weapons that after the war were left in possession of former Italian soldiers. My aunt recalls that Grandpa had 2 handguns, but he buried one of them in the garden of the town hall. We speculate that it could have been a German gun, which Grandpa held on to for personal safety probably, and it wouldn't be absurd considering that often Italian Social Republic soldiers used German weapons. If he would have brought that German handgun to the authorities, they would have been suspicious. Theoretically, that gun is still buried under there. Grandpa kept quiet about his involvement in the Italian Social Republic, but never denied it to his family and his closest friends. He never liked to talk about the war, and in fact what I tell you is mostly reconstructions. I know that after the war he never got involved into politics again, and when some fascist remnants tried to involve him, he refused. He realized how deep he fell for the fascist propaganda and the big mistakes of the regime. He never blamed partisans nor allies, and even befriended them. In 1952, the last chapter of Grandpa's peculiar World War II story, he was awarded 3 medals of military valor by his enemies. Of course, this is a bit of a stretch. The Italian Republic, which is the descendant of the Kingdom of Italy, awarded him these 3 medals, when effectively, by joining the Italian Social Republic in World War II, he fought against the Kingdom of Italy. This happened because first, the medals in question are about his service in Greece and Yugoslavia, so before the Armistice of 1943 and the Italian Social Republic. And second, the authorities didn't have proofs about his involvement in the Italian Social Republic. In the 50s he lost to illness both his brother and his wife, my grandma, but for the rest he lived peacefully and he died in 1998. As he became blind in his final years, I don't think he ever even saw me properly. I just remember him sitting on a big-ass armchair with a cane. And here ends the story that I wanted to tell you. A personal note, why did I choose to make this video? It's many years that I have feelings that I don't like to have inside me. Bitterness, rancor, spite, you pick one. I can't accept the hypocrisy of the history that was taught to me. It might be because I've always been the stereotypical kid who always thought what he wanted and did what he wanted and never listened to anybody, something that didn't bring me to many places in life. So I've always maintained this rebellious attitude towards the history of my country, I grew this big sense of distrust, is that even a word? I don't know, towards the authorities and how history is written and the present and what you see in front of you. I'll give you the biggest example. If I were to follow the common rhetoric and give the teachings for granted, I would believe that my great-grandfather, who fought in World War I, was a hero, because the war was won. In World War I, the lovely king and government entered the war against the will of the population, sending my great-grandfather, alongside many other Italians, to wage a war of aggression against Austria. For what? For what? A few pieces of land that most people didn't care about? My great-grandfather was sent to war with a gun pointed at his back, facing execution in case of refusal, to fight a war against people he had no problems with, to conquer towns he never even heard of. He was even lucky because he was sent to the Yugoslav front, which was a smaller theater. And I should see him as a war hero, and his amazing victory is celebrated to this day because some other countries won the war for Italy. After World War II, great-grandfather received a medal for his service in World War I, which he gladly accepted, but after World War I, he never trusted the Italian government ever again for the shameful things they made him do. On the other hand, my grandfather, who had the fault of refusing to surrender in World War II and remaining loyal to his German allies, who volunteered to be put in a prison camp to not kill his hometown friends, who tried to keep on going even in face of certain defeat, he must be considered a monster, or actually not even remembered, being cast into oblivion and forgotten forever. Yes, because he was a fascist, but mostly because the war was lost. Don't think I don't realize that Grandpa was misguided and brainwashed by the blind nationalism of fascism. But when you realize that both World War I and World War II were wars of aggression for Italy, with only few differences, you realized how biased history is. I will never accept the fairy tales in which World War II Italy is considered bad, but World War I Italy, in which the government and the king started a war of aggression against the will of its own population, is considered good. Or that post-World War II Italy under NATO, with American bases and nuclear weapons, is something instead to appreciate. As usual, my childish response to that is a big middle finger, and the distrust I feel towards my country doesn't even come specifically from my grandpa and my great-grandpa, because I never even met them. I don't know what kind of people they were. I know some of the things they did, some of the things they said, but I never met them. I never got to know them. But they are two perfect examples of hundreds of thousands of Italians who died in the 20th century, which my country is insulting the memory of with its hypocritical biased teaching, in my opinion. As for me, I can't really change this situation, so here comes the reason why I egoistically made this video. It makes me feel a bit better knowing that at least I put a story from a different perspective out there. I don't aim at justifying people, I don't aim at changing ideals, I'm simply highlighting a story that otherwise would have never been told, a perspective that is very rarely looked through, of people who are very rarely remembered. History is full of people who are forgotten. Already in the 20th century, just imagine in the Middle Ages or in ancient history. And I think it's important to not let these people be deleted and completely forgotten. So in my little, I brought you this story, which was very difficult for me to write. I don't know if Grandpa would have liked that. If you did, you're welcome. If you didn't, I'm sorry. But yeah, I really try to keep a balance and take things lighthearted and not dwell too much on the past that wasn't even my own past, as I know that despising and hating things really consume people, and I have other things to take care of. I thank you for following me through this long video, and I will see you next time, whatever I will do, hopefully something more fun. In an ideal world, people would be defined by themselves, not by their countries or governments. Countless people, especially in ancient times, have been omitted from the history written by their compatriots or foreigners. There is no denying their part in history, whether they were in the right or in the wrong, warmongers or pacifists, and everything in between. Even though I despise war, I'm glad I was able to tell this story from a different perspective and shed some light on one of the many remote and dark corners of history. Thanks for watching.